Welcome to Eastern Roman history. Today we're going to be talking about the Anarchy emperors. It was a time of crisis for the Byzantine Empire, and these were the stewards of that great state throughout this era of darkness.
So the Emperor Leontius is the man who kicks out Justinian II, having cut his nose off. He rules the empire for 3 years from 695 to 698 with some measure of success. For the first year of his reign, it is fairly quiet. There doesn't seem to be any attacks on Arab frontiers or in Africa. He even has enough time to dredge one of the ports in Constantinople. The only failure of his reign seems to be the loss of Africa, which is largely not his fault. So when the Arabs take Carthage initially in 697, and then he sends the strategia to retake it, and they do so, retaking Carthage during the winter, and they hold it. And then the Arabs counterattack after assembling additional forces from the heartland of the empire. It's only after that that the Roman forces are pushed out, and then they sail to Crete on their way back to get reinforcements and also tell Leontius about what's happened. And it's there that one of the more junior officers mutiny and decide to proclaim Tiberius III, who at the time was called Apsimar, emperor. And he was a Drongarius, so he was one of the officers in the navy. And then they sail to Constantinople, and Leontius is deposed and forced into exile, which he languishes in until he's eventually executed by Justinian II. So he made the right moves, and he does also have an unfortunate outbreak of bubonic plague in Constantinople during his reign, which didn't help either. But I think he was fairly competent, although we don't know that much about what he did. And the main thing is Africa. And perhaps you can take points away for him for its loss, symbolically at the very least. But a lot of it is more the fault of the army that was sent to take it, rather than him directly. What do you think, Mark?
I do think that I've put him in decent. I don't think one can put him any higher because he does lose Africa. I certainly don't think the failure to retake Carthage is his fault. But the actual loss of Africa in itself, the Umayyads invading the first year of his reign, an emperor has to be accountable for their territorial losses in that regard, I think. So I'm not inclined to put him any higher than decent. I do think it's clear he was a competent emperor. Were it not for the manner of his accession and he sent a group of officers to take Carthage who were a bunch of
traitors.
Yes, I think he could have turned out well, but unfortunately we don't know. But I do think that there is the makings there of a decent emperor.
I'm going to put him in mediocre. I do agree that he is perhaps one of the better emperors of the Anarchy emperors. And I do think that blaming him for the loss of Africa, even symbolically, is perhaps overly harsh. But there's nothing that really stands out about his reign either. There's no kind of notable accomplishments other than what might be expected from a good emperor. Yes, so I'm going to put him in mediocre. So there, that's Leontius. Now, Tiberius III is interesting. He's the longest reigning of the Anarchy emperors. He reigned from 698 to 705. And his brother Heraclius the Monostrategos is perhaps one of the more notable generals of the late 7th and early 8th century, and scores several quite notable victories against the Arabs, who is pretty much, he is able to check their raids and advances into Anatolia, although he is less successful in defending Armenia. But Tiberius III himself, although he seems to be quite a competent administrator, so after Africa is lost, he is the one that establishes Strategia in Sardinia and Sicily. But other from that, we don't really get much of an idea of what he's really doing as emperor. He kind of just sits there, not doing all that much. But maybe that's how the division of labour was between the emperor and his brother Heraclius, in that Heraclius was the main commander and Tiberius was the civil. But I think fundamentally he was unable to deal with Justinian II. And although he tried to get the Khazars, and I think he also tried to get the Bulgars, I may be mistaken on that, he was ultimately deposed, and both he, Leontius, and all of their associates, such as Heraclius, were executed. He ultimately lost the throne he took, but I almost think that if it wasn't for Heraclius, his brother, he would probably be in the incompetent because he just doesn't really inspire that much. You don't really get that much of an impression about his reign, although that could just be the sources. But I think his accommodation of the western provinces and his brother's success mean that he is a mediocre emperor. How about you, Mark?
Yes, I also have placed him in mediocre. You are correct. A lot of it is by virtue of his brother's activities, rather than his own. He is on the throne for a good 7 years in a time of crisis, so which in itself is an achievement. I have also put him in mediocre. Obviously, his biggest failure was the whole Justinian matter. I would say he recognises the situation the empire is in, for sure. Yeah. Even if his response to it at times is perhaps a bit subpar.
I've put him in mediocre. So we have done Justinian II in a Heraclian Emperor video, and we've talked about both his reigns quite extensively. But his successor, I think, is bad emperor. It's true that when Justinian comes in, he executes most of the members of Leontius and Tiberius III's. But then Philippicus does the same thing to anyone that doesn't join him. So he executes the Count of Opsicion, as well as Justinian's entire family, so the boy Tiberius, as well as his wife Theodora, the Khazar. So the Heraclian dynasty is wiped out, and also Justinian's loyalists. So you've got another set of courtiers, commanders, which have just been removed once again. That's another thing about this period. You have a rapid turnover of the top echelons of society, which in the empire at this point is quite a bad thing, because it's that top echelon that are running the bureaucracy, leading the armies into battle, generally a vital part in the defense of and running of that empire. And so, with all of this rapid turnover of talent, you see some elements of sort of law and order starting to break down. And actually you have a comment by Nicephorus the Patriarch saying how it was in this period that literacy had seriously declined by this point. Philippicus spent his reign indulging himself. He revives the Monothelite controversy, because he himself was a Monothelite. So he brings back that spectre of religious controversy that had been set to bed by Constantine IV. He also expels refugee Armenians from the empire, so a needless depopulation, whereas many of these Armenians could be useful in helping to defend the empire and till the land. He is deposed within about 18 months of his taking the emperorship, and he is deposed by the Count of the Opsicion. He is perhaps notable for being the first emperor to be blinded, rather than the cutting off of the nose and the slitting of the tongue. He had no successes. The empire's frontiers are crumbling, and he has no answers for it, and it is in fact adding to those problems.
I would put him in bad. He clearly is not a particularly good emperor. His religious controversy, it didn't just affect within the empire. Also, obviously, he didn't get recognition from the Pope because of his abolition of the canons of the Sixth Ecumenical Council.
Indeed.
He isn't a good emperor. Luckily, I suppose one could say he was deposed before he could do any more damage.
And deposed not by Anastasius, but he's the one that benefited from it. Which leads to a very awkward situation, because it's because of that rise to power that Anastasius II, who at the time was called Artemius, got deposed in the end. So he ruled for over 2 years, and he was a bureaucrat. He took the name Anastasius II in honour of the bureaucrat emperor Anastasius I from the late 5th, early 6th century. And Anastasius I think he's quite a good emperor for the time. Rumours of an Arab attack on Constantinople are confirmed, and he sets about preparing for it. So a lot of his reign is spent preparing Constantinople for attack. So the sea walls are repaired, supplies are stocked up. Well, depending on how you take it, the excess population of Constantinople are expelled from the capital to reduce the number of mouths to feed. Siege weapons are mounted on the towers of the Theodosian walls. So a lot of the preparation for the attack, which is coming, happens under Anastasius, and that reaps lots of benefits when the siege actually happens in 717 to 18 under Leo III. He's deposed because of a naval operation that breaks out. So the Arabs send a fleet to cut down trees in the Byzantine Empire in an area called Lycia in southwestern Anatolia to build more ships, and he sends the Carabisianoi navy to intercept them, which are also carrying the Opsikion. They arrive in preparation for them, and they murder their commander, rebel, the Carabisianoi go home, and the Opsikion then travel first to Adramyttium, which is part of the Opsikion Strategis, which is where their army's based, and they find a bloke to proclaim emperor, and then they lay siege to Constantinople. And Anastasius II, he marches out to try and intercept them. He reaches Nicaea, but they reach Constantinople first, and hasn't got a large enough force to counter the Opsikion, plus an open battle at this stage would be deadly. So eventually he decides to make peace, and his rival, Theodosius, allows him to retire and abdicate as emperor. So he ends up in Thessalonica. And then the Opsikion take the city and proclaim, and Theodosius III is crowned. I think I would class him as a decent emperor. He is very talented, and I think he gets rid of the religious controversy caused by Philippicus. He reinstitutes the Sixth Ecumenical Council. He prepares Constantinople. He assigns trusted strategoi to the commands in Anatolia. And there's a real emphasis of regenerating the empire and trying to put it back on a positive footing after the incompetence of Philippicus and the failures occurring in Justinian II's reign. And perhaps some of his success happens as a result of the attempts at regeneration under Justinian and him. But ultimately, because he had to execute the Count of Opsikion right at the start of his reign, the Opsikion hated him and eventually, after 2 and a bit years, deposed him. So he was doomed from the start, in a sense. Where would you put Anastasius II?
I would also put him in decent. His end is rather bad luck. I mean, as an emperor, you can at least, I think, see, not necessarily living up to his namesake, but at least getting a bit of his spirit in terms of administrating the empire. He successfully mended the religious schism. His preparation of Constantinople, I think, shouldn't be frowned upon. His repairing of the walls and the like is a reason why the empire does survive 717. So yes, I have put him in decent.
He does actually try to come back in 719 after the siege is over and try to depose Leo III, but his conspiracy is discovered and he's executed. So he was not the best usurper, but by then I think his time had come and gone, really. Why don't you tell us where you would put Theodosius III?
Well, Theodosius III is, I think he fits this category more so than any other emperor either of us put into it. So I have put him in incompetent.
Yes.
Because he, of course, was a tax collector who was made emperor against his will, and suddenly he was in charge of the entire empire. It'd be like putting perhaps like the local TV license man as prime minister without any training.
Yes. I do agree. I think he is perhaps the archetypal incompetent emperor, and it is perhaps to his credit that he knew it himself. You can certainly understand it, because the situation he was in was not exactly enviable. The Arabs had already started their invasion by the time he took the throne, so he had virtually no time to set himself up. He was emperor, I think he was emperor for a little bit longer than Philippicus, so it's another kind of over a year, roughly 18 months. So the Arabs had sent a large land force through Asia Minor, and they were pillaging and plundering their way through Anatolia. And it's only because of the quick thinking of Leo the Isaurian that they didn't manage to capture one of the army headquarters, Amorian. Main strategic points in the plateau wasn't taken, and so they end up in Pergamon. And then you also have the fleet sail round the following year. So he is in a crisis. He was, as you say, an emperor from humble beginnings, a taxman. There was an interesting article written by a chap called Graham Sumner some years ago. He was in an article talking about the chronology of events for the 3 post-Heraclean emperors, Philippicus, Anastasius, and Theodosius. He did postulate that possibly he was the son of Tiberius III, also known as Apsimar. His speculation is based on the fact that Tiberius had a son called Theodosius, and he does actually show up in the Council of Hierea in 754, the Iconoclast Council. And he based this assumption on the fact that when Theodosius III is deposed and abdicates, he goes to Ephesus. And he thought that the bishop of Ephesus was the same Theodosius as the emperor. This is a theory. It doesn't seem to hold that much water, other than they shared the same name. And the eminent scholars Cyril Mango and Roger Scott thought that this was highly implausible, and it seems more probable that Theodosius III was a tax collector from Adramyttium and nothing more. But to Theodosius' credit, he does manage to get an alliance with the Bulgars, which is why Tervel comes to rescue Leo III. So he does continue to make plans to deal with the Arab threat, but he's so completely out of his depth that Leo III, after he deals with the Arabs, he immediately rebels along with Artabasdos, who is the strategos of Armeniacon, and they seize the imperial family, which just so happens to be in easy grabbing distance in Bithynia, and there's a reported scene by both Theophanes and Nicephorus, Patriarch, where he approaches the Senate, asks them what to do, and they say that he should abdicate in favour of Leo III. Leo III accepts this offer, and he and his family are allowed to retire into clerical exile. So actually it ends quite well for Theodosius III. He seems to have been quite a nice fellow. But, he was incompetent, ultimately. There we go, and after him you have Leo III, who rescues the empire. Another man from humble beginnings.
Indeed,
Yes,
indeed.
yeah. Except this time his armies followed him.
They're an interesting bunch. I think the quality of the times around them is reflected in the quality of the emperors one gets.
Yes.
It's clear with this cadre that they weren't in the best of times. But we do get very soon a series of brilliant emperors, and ones I look forward to discussing with you.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
I hope everyone enjoyed listening to our ranking of the 20 years of anarchy emperors. And this has been Eastern Roman History.